In June 1967, Israel fought 3 Arab armies simultaneously: Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and won in less than a week. The war lasted 132 hours. In that time, tanks crossed deserts, fighter jets rewrote the rules of aerial warfare, and paratroopers descended on fortified positions in the dark. The outcome reshaped the Middle East forever. This is every major weapon that made it happen, and what it could and couldn't do. Aircrafts of Israel. Dassault Mirage IIICJ. The Mirage III was the crown jewel of the Israeli Air Force. A French-built supersonic interceptor, capable of Mach 2.2, it carried air-to-air missiles and cannon, and it was the weapon Israel used to destroy Arab air forces on the ground on June 5, 1967. Israeli Mirage pilots had already downed 6 Syrian MiGs in April before the war even started. On day 1 of the war, Mirages flew low over the Mediterranean, came in from the north, and caught Egyptian aircraft parked in neat rows. They were the single most decisive weapon of the entire conflict. A-4 Skyhawk. The American-built A-4 Skyhawk was a subsonic light attack jet that the US had sold Israel in 1966. Designed for precision ground attack, it carried bombs, rockets, and cannon. In the Six-Day War, Skyhawks participated in strikes on Arab airfields alongside the Mirage, expanding Israel's strike capacity. Simple, rugged, and easy to maintain, the Skyhawk gave Israel a second wave of strike aircraft when every sortie counted. Israel flew an extraordinary number of sorties per aircraft per day, a feat of logistics as much as hardware. Dassault Mystère 4 and Super Mystère. The Mystère 4 and its successor the Super Mystère were earlier French swept-wing jets, still flying in the IAF's order of battle. Slower than the Mirage, but battle-proven, they flew ground attack missions during the Sinai campaign, hitting armor, artillery positions, and supply lines. The Super Mystère was the first aircraft in the Middle East capable of supersonic flight in level flight. Both types were used in the opening strikes. In a war where every operational aircraft was needed, these older jets still earned their place. Foucault CM.170 Magister. The Foucault Magister was a French-built twin-jet trainer that Israel converted into a light attack aircraft. Slow and lightly armed, it carried machine guns and rockets. It had no business fighting a modern air war, but Israel used it anyway. Magisters were deployed against Jordanian armor on the West Bank on June 5, flying close air support for ground forces. Several were hit by ground fire. That Israel flew trainers in combat tells you everything about how outnumbered they felt. Aircrafts of Arab states, MiG-21. The MiG-21 was the premier Soviet fighter of the era, a Mach 2 interceptor widely supplied to Soviet-aligned states. Egypt operated around 120, Syria around 50. It was fast, nimble, and armed with cannon and missiles. On paper, it was a match for the Mirage. In practice, most never got off the ground. Israel's opening strikes caught the Egyptian MiG-21 fleet parked on runways. Syria lost 32 MiG-21s in a single day. The MiG-21 was a world-class aircraft, flown by armies that were not given the chance to use it. MiG-15 and MiG-17, older Soviet subsonic jets, operated by Egypt, Syria, and Iraq as second-line fighters. The MiG-17 was a capable dogfighter at lower speeds, and had been effective in Korea-era combat. By 1967, both types were outdated against the Mirage. Syria lost 23 MiG-15s and MiG-17s in the opening Israeli strikes. These aircraft represented the older tier of Soviet military aid, useful against less capable opponents, but not against Israel's frontline force. Ilyushin Il-28 Beagle. The Il-28 was a Soviet twin-jet light bomber, essentially 1940s technology, still in Arab service by 1967. Egypt and Syria each operated small numbers. The Il-28 could carry conventional bombs or, in theory, nuclear weapons, a fact that contributed to Israeli anxiety before the war. Syria lost 2 Il-28s in the first day's strikes. As a delivery platform for strategic strikes on Israeli cities or infrastructure, the Il-28 was what Israeli planners feared most. Its early destruction was a priority. Hawker Hunter. The British-built Hawker Hunter was a swept-wing subsonic fighter bomber operated by Jordan, and, as a curiosity, 2 Lebanese examples that briefly crossed the Israeli border. A capable and handsome aircraft designed in the early 1950s, it was no match for the Mirage in aerial combat. Jordan's Hunters flew sorties on June 5, before Israeli counterstrikes eliminated most of Jordan's air force. 2 Lebanese Hunters strafed Israeli positions in Galilee, and 1 was shot down. A reminder that even peripheral actors brought real equipment. Tu-16 Badger Egypt operated Soviet Tupolev Tu-16 medium jet bombers, a genuine long-range strategic bomber, capable of reaching deep into Israel. Their existence was one reason Israel felt it could not absorb a first strike, and had to hit first. Most were destroyed in the June 5 opening strikes before they could be used. The destruction of Egypt's Tu-16 fleet eliminated the most credible Arab threat to Israeli cities from the air. Tanks of Israel. Centurion, Shot. Israel's primary tank was the British Centurion, which the IDF called the Shot. Upgraded with a powerful 105mm Royal Ordnance gun, improved engine, and Israeli modifications, the Shot was one of the most capable tanks in the world by 1967. It bore the brunt of the armored fighting in the Sinai and on the Golan Heights. Well-armored, accurate, and reliable, the Shot outperformed Soviet-supplied tanks in crew training and gunnery. Israel operated hundreds of Centurions, and they formed the backbone of the armored assault. M48 Patton, the American M48 Patton medium tank, sold to Israel by the Johnson administration in 1965, was Israel's second major armored type. Equipped with a 90mm gun and later upgraded to the 105mm. It formed the core of Israeli armored brigades, attacking Egypt and Jordan. American armor fighting Soviet armor on Middle Eastern sand, the M48 proved effective, though its gasoline engine was a fire risk. Israel's tactical use of armor, night attacks, speed, aggression, mattered more than the hardware alone. AMX-13. The French-built AMX-13 was a light tank armed with a 75mm gun. By 1967, it was outclassed by heavier Soviet armor. But Israel used it in reconnaissance and supporting roles. Its oscillating turret with an autolator was innovative, but the thin armor made it vulnerable in direct engagements against T-54s and T-55s. In the Six-Day War, it played a secondary role, a weapon built for a different era, trying to keep up with a fast-moving armored war. Sherman, M50 and M51 Super Sherman. Israel took the aging American World War II Sherman and rebuilt it into something much more lethal. The M51 Super Sherman mounted a French 105mm gun in a modified turret, giving a 1940s tank the firepower to kill modern Soviet armor. Israeli M51 Shermans destroyed T-54s and T-55s in the Sinai. The Super Sherman was proof that Israeli military ingenuity could extend the life of obsolete equipment well beyond what anyone expected. Hundreds fought in all theaters. Tanks of Arab states, T-54 and T-55. The Soviet T-54 and T-55 were the most modern tanks in the Arab arsenal, and the most numerous. Egypt had around 950 tanks in the Sinai, the majority T-54-55s. The T-54-55 featured a 100mm gun, well-sloped armor, and a low silhouette. On paper, it was competitive with Israeli tanks. In practice, Egyptian armor was poorly deployed, spread out, lacking initiative, and abandoned when air cover disappeared. Hundreds of T-54s were captured intact in the Sinai, many with engines still running. Syria's T-54s on the Golan fought harder before being overwhelmed. T-34-85. Egypt and Syria still operated large numbers of the Soviet World War II era T-34, armed with an 85mm gun. By 1967, the T-34 was completely obsolete against modern armor. Its presence in Arab order of battle reflects the sheer mass of Soviet military aid to the region during the 1950s and 60s. In the Sinai campaign, T-34s in second echelon positions were destroyed in large numbers. Israeli pilots particularly targeted T-34 columns from the air, where the old tank had no answer. IS-3 heavy tank. Egypt operated Soviet IS-3 Stalin heavy tanks, a World War II design with massive 122mm gun and thick armor. The IS-3's distinctive pike nose and rounded turret had shocked Western observers at the 1945 Berlin Victory Parade. By 1967, it was slow, mechanically unreliable, and difficult to maintain. Israel's 105mm guns could penetrate it at combat ranges. Few IS-3s played any meaningful role in the fighting before being destroyed or abandoned alongside the rest of Egypt's Sinai forces. M47 and M48 Patton Jordan, backed by Western support, operated American M47 and M48 Patton tanks, the same family as Israel's own armor. On the West Bank, Jordanian Pattons fought Israeli Pattons and Centurions in some of the war's most intense armored clashes. Jordanian crews were better trained than their Egyptian or Syrian counterparts, and the fighting for Jerusalem and the West Bank was the toughest Israel faced on any front. The equipment was matched. The outcome came down to air cover, initiative, and numbers. Artillery D-30 and BS-3 field guns. Soviet-supplied artillery formed the backbone of Arab fire support. Egypt deployed around 1,000 artillery pieces in the Sinai, including 122mm D-30 howitzers and 100mm BS-3 anti-tank guns. Syria used heavy artillery to shell northern Israeli settlements from the Golan Heights for days before Israeli ground forces attacked. Without air cover, Arab artillery became static and vulnerable to Israeli airstrikes. Massed Soviet guns gave the Arab armies their most dangerous defensive capability, particularly in prepared positions. 25-pounder. The British 25-pounder field gun from World War II was still in active use by both Israeli and Jordanian forces in 1967, a testament to how different equipment eras coexisted in this war. Israel used them for fire support. Jordan used them to shell West Jerusalem on June 5. Effective as direct and indirect fire weapons, they were reliable workhorses that both sides knew well. The sight of a 1940s British gun shelling a city in 1967 captures the strange layering of weapons generations that defined this conflict. BM-21 Grad Multiple Rocket Launcher. Egypt fielded Soviet BM-21 Grad 122mm multiple rocket launchers, capable of saturating a large area with rockets in seconds. Area suppression weapons rather than precision instruments, they were designed to break up infantry and armor formations. Israeli air superiority neutralized much of Egypt's indirect fire capability before it could be used effectively. But the presence of BM-21s underlined how comprehensively the Soviet Union had armed Egypt for a conventional war. Infantry weapons, FNFAL. Israel's standard infantry rifle at the start of the 1967 war was the Belgian FNFAL, chambered in 7.62mm NATO. A reliable, accurate, and hard-hitting battle rifle, it was widely used by Western and Western-aligned militaries worldwide. Israeli paratroopers carried the FAL into the Old City of Jerusalem, into Sinai, and up the Golan Heights. Later replaced by the domestically designed Galil, the FAL served Israel well through its most dramatic military victories. AK-47, AKM. Soviet-supplied AK-47 and AKM assault rifles were the standard infantry weapon of all three Arab armies. Lighter and more compact than the FAL, firing 7.62 by 39mm intermediate cartridge. The AK was optimized for close combat, reliable and nearly impossible to jam even in desert sand. The AK-47 was arguably the better weapon for the conditions. At the infantry level, the Arab armies were well armed. The problem was not the rifles, it was command, coordination, and the destruction of air cover that unraveled everything else. Uzi submachine gun. The Israeli-designed Uzi was already a decade old by 1967, but remained the weapon of vehicle crews, paratroopers, and rear echelon forces. Compact and reliable, it fired 9mm pistol ammunition and was effective at close range. Israeli tankers carried Uzis as their personal weapon. The design was so successful it had been adopted by the West German Bundeswehr and the US Secret Service. In the cramped confines of the Old City of Jerusalem, the Uzi was particularly suited to the narrow streets and doorways. Bazooka, B-10 and B-11 recoilless rifles. Both sides fielded recoilless rifles for infantry anti-armor work. Israel used American-supplied 106mm M40 recoilless rifles mounted on jeeps, a highly mobile tank tower. Arab forces used Soviet B-10 and B-11 recoilless rifles in infantry anti-tank roles. These weapons could penetrate the side and rear armor of most tanks of the era. In the urban fighting for Jerusalem, Israeli jeep-mounted recoilless rifles proved devastatingly effective against Jordanian armor in streets too narrow for full tank maneuver. Naval forces Eilat-class destroyers. Israel's naval destroyer INS Eilat became the first warship in history to be sunk by a ship-launched guided missile, though this happened in October 1967, after the Six-Day War. During the war itself, Israeli naval vessels imposed a blockade and conducted patrols. The Navy played a supporting role compared to the air and ground war, but the Eilat's later sinking by an Egyptian Styx missile would permanently change naval warfare doctrine. Its presence in the fleet during June 1967 is a reminder of how close that lesson nearly came. Motor torpedo boats. Both Israel and Egypt operated fast motor torpedo boats for coastal operations. Israeli torpedo boats conducted operations in the Red Sea and Mediterranean. Egypt's navy attempted torpedo attacks against Israeli vessels with limited success. The naval war of June 1967 was largely secondary to the land and air campaign. But coastal operations in the Gulf of Aqaba, particularly around Sharm el-Sheikh, had a direct strategic impact on the war's origins, given Egypt's blockade of the Straits of Tiran that had helped trigger the conflict. Helicopters. Sikorsky S-58. Israeli paratroopers were carried in Sikorsky S-58 helicopters on the night assault against Egyptian artillery positions at Qatif on June 5, 1967. A daring night insertion that landed men 2 miles from fortified enemy guns. It was one of the more audacious operations of the war. The S-58 was an American-built medium utility helicopter. In an era before dedicated attack helicopters changed warfare, the AS-58 was used as a pure transport, delivering soldiers into darkness behind enemy lines. Conclusion. In 132 hours, Israel flew over 3,000 combat sorties, destroyed roughly 450 Arab aircraft, captured over 700 tanks, and seized territories 3 times its own size. The Arab coalition brought 1,700 tanks, 2,400 artillery pieces, and 500 aircraft to the fight. On paper, the numbers favored the Arabs. But paper numbers don't fight wars. Israel had better training, better maintenance, faster decision-making, above all, a plan. The weapons mattered. The Mirage III was world-class. The Centurion's 105mm gun was lethal. The Super Sherman was a triumph of improvisation. What mattered more was how they were used. Weapons don't win wars. People do. And in June 1967, Israel's pilots, tankers, and paratroopers used every piece of equipment with a precision and aggression that the hardware alone could never have delivered.